When it comes to the flow of your track, there's two things that are important. One is the automations that you put on your synths and main sequences, and the other ones are your effects. Today we're going to take a look at this project over here, and we're going to look at that second part. And this will kind of be a continuation of an earlier video that I did in which I talked about some of the forgotten elements of psytrance. So when it comes to the effects, let me show you what I mean. I have this group over here which contains all of my effects. Now there's a few things in here that are very specific to the track, but most tracks are going to have stuff like downlifters, uplifters, and that is the main thing that I want to talk about today. So here's a very simple example of that. You can hear we have a riser there that increases the energy over time. It allows you to rise into a certain point, and these are placed in such a way that they rise into a point where the segment changes. So here we have one type of element, here we have one type of main sequence, and here we have a different one. And you can hear how the riser is helping us move along to the next part. What you may also hear is how the riser is very low in the mix. You don't really hear it up until the fill over here. And then this particular riser is also being masked by a reverse crash over here as well. As you can see, there's a crash that goes alongside with the riser and basically does the same thing. Now the reason for that is, as I said, the flow of your track is really determined by two different elements. And as I said before, those are the automations and the effects. Now the automations are the part that in my opinion are the most important, because that is usually your main musical idea for a segment that really needs to shine through, and therefore the effects need to take a backseat and become like a supporting element to the main idea of your track. When it comes to these kind of risers, what that means for me is that it takes a long time before it becomes audible, and even then it is really low in the mix. Now this is of course still the production mix, so this is going to change a little bit, but in the final mixing project I'm also going to be applying the same philosophy and basically set the volume in the same way. Because when it comes to this priority, I do like to just use the volume, just turn it down in terms of volume. What you can sometimes do is make it a little bit wider, make it a little bit more stereo, or have it filter in over time. And I usually do that when I'm designing an effect from scratch. In this case, this is just a sample from a sample pack. Now there is a little bit of preliminary EQing on here, and there was a point where there is a filter as well. I believe this is somewhere else in the track, right over here. As you can see, it just moves up a little bit more. And that is just so that I can adapt the riser to that specific part of the track. You can also see over here that the last beat is missing. So you can see over here, this is missing, and that is because I really wanted this other sound to come through there. And therefore I don't want even the riser to interfere with this part. Now the opposite of a riser is a downlifter. Here we have an example over here. This is what it sounds like. And you can hear it starts with very high energy and then lowers over time. So instead of rising into a particular point and lifting the energy up as it goes along, it is doing the exact opposite in that it takes a point and then the energy becomes lower from that point. And this is again something that you can layer on top of automations, and in my specific case also crashes. When it comes to the downlifter part, I really like to use a lot of crashes. As you can see in this project over here, there's many different crashes. And in this particular case, every 8 bars, there's basically a crash, unless we have a little bit of a lower energy segment that is every 16 bars. But this does the same thing in that it's high energy at the start and then just slows down. You can hear this burst of noise that immediately kind of collapses and becomes lower in volume. And it just indicates to the listener that there's a big impact over here at the start. And then it just slowly fizzles out, which allows the listener to concentrate more and more on the main elements of the track. Again, this kind of thing, when it comes to the crashes, it's not mixed in a way that it's particularly loud, like it doesn't completely overpower the main sound, but it just gives it a little bit more impact and it just grabs the attention a little bit more than if it wasn't there. So without the crash and the downlifter down here, we get something that sounds like this. It doesn't really feel like a high point at this part of the track, but with the crashes on and the downlifter on, you can really hear the difference that that gives. You can hear we have this high point and it maybe takes a bar or two before we get to the lower energy where the track is normally sitting, and it just continues up until this point where there's another crash. And because there's no downlifter here, there's only the crash, it is a little bit less like energetic and it's a little bit less of an effect. And that is one of the ways that I like to differentiate the start of a section with the halfway point of a section. That is usually how I layer my crashes. As I said, this is 8 bars. And of course, a whole section is usually 16 bars. Now, one of the things that I often hear inside of other people's music is that they do something like this. They take a downlifter and just place it everywhere, even at the start of their drops. And this sounds really off to me because generally speaking, this is not yet at the high energy parts. The downlifters to me only make sense when you're in a high energy part. And even then, I don't tend to use it all the time. So this part over here, while it is high energy, as you can see by the drums and here as well, there's not actually any downlifters over here, just a bunch of risers that rise into that part. But if you just listen to what we made before, where the low energy part, where there aren't any top drums, where it's just the kick and bass, if we give that a downlifter, it really sounds off to me. Of course, this track wasn't written with this in mind, but even then, I find it really hard to write it around an idea like that. And in contrast, without the downlifters, you get a sound that sounds like this. Now, the final thing that I should probably talk about is the impacts. When it comes to impacts, these are sound like this. Let me see if I can find one. Over here is one. Here's another example over here. You can hear that this is an element that has a lot of low end, and this is really, as the name suggests, something that is meant to impact you in the chest, as opposed to high frequencies, which is just something that you only hear with your ears. Now, what that means is that I don't layer these kind of sounds on top of my kick and bass. This is in the intro part. Here you can see that there's a bass and a kick, but at this point it is still filtered. So you can hear that the volume of the kick and bass is lower and the sub bass of both of those elements aren't as pronounced, meaning that there's a lot of space for me in the mix that I can add another element into that is also providing lower frequencies. Seriously, what that means for me is that in terms of the impacts, they're only really going to sit over here and over here, which is the intro and the breakdown. Maybe I'll have an impact at the end here when we go from the kick and bass into the fade out. So this would be the outro segment where you would mix out of the track, and then when the track actually needs to end, this is where the fade out would be. In this particular case, there's no impact there because I'm doing something with a more melodic element where I just want it to flow out. But other times when I want the track to just completely stop there, I have another impact that just signifies the end of the track. So as you can probably tell, there's a pretty neat balance between having structure in the way that you're placing your effects and not working in an overly structured manner. In the sense that when it comes to the placement of the elements, you want to place the downlifter, for example, on the start of every 16 bars so that they start a section, but you only want to do that in the higher frequency parts. So you don't want to go through a track and just every 16 bars have a downlifter, because that is going to sound repetitive and it's going to sound boring, and then the flow doesn't really evolve, it just does the same thing over and over again. Because what I often hear is people just placing their effects willy-nilly in the track, not just in terms of the structure, but also in terms of the volume. I've heard tracks where the volume of the risers and the downlifters is way too high and they actually start to overpower the main element, and even sometimes become harsh to listen to. Because you're rising in pitch, you need to keep that in mind when it comes to mixing these things, in that the higher frequencies, when they become louder and louder and louder, which is what happens when you go higher and higher in pitch with your riser, at some points the riser element can become too harsh. So if you have it low in the track at the beginning of the riser and it just starts rising and rising and it becomes louder in volume, towards the end of the riser it is just way too loud. And for that reason, one of the criteria that I have for most of my risers and downlifters is that at the end or the beginning of the clip, you don't actually hear them anymore. At the point where the lowest energy, where they start rising or they stop downlifting, you don't hear them anymore and there's nothing there. The other thing that does for you is it doesn't suddenly come in as an element, it just kind of slowly fades in. And then of course it starts working together with the automations and almost becomes like a coherent, like extra layer of what is happening in the automations. So for example, if you have an acid line, you can imagine that acid line going up over 8 bars, we'll have a riser that towards the end of that segment is just coming in, and it becomes this extra layer of adding extra energy to that part of the track before you go into the next segment. Now, if you want to learn a lot more about all of the considerations that you have to make when it comes to the structure of your track, including where you place the downlifters and the uplifters, then another video that you could watch is my video on arrangement. Even though that's a little bit of an older video and the quality isn't the best, it still explains all of the rules that I still follow up until this day. The final thing that I want to talk about is just the quantity of elements. When it comes to risers and downlifters, I do have main elements, in the sense that this is my main downlifter and this over here is my main riser. I haven't placed this in the whole part of the track, but you can imagine that there will be some more copies of it over here and maybe a few over here as well, where we are in the second segment. So this is the higher energy segment of the second drop. So I expect that I might add 1 or 2 more risers over here and maybe 2 to 3 more over here as well. But what I often also like to do is have different risers and downlifters for different parts of the track, especially in the break is where I have that. So we have a whole bunch of different effects here in the break. You can hear how this is basically one continuous flow from element to element. There's a bunch of different elements, of course, that make that happen. First of all, there's this one over here, which is essentially both a riser and a downlifter. This is a whole bunch of different noise stuff. I have some other more creative downlifters like this one over here. And then over here in this 16 bar buildup, we have one main riser of noise over here. And then over half of the time, what I'm doing is I'm layering that in with 2 other risers. So this one over here is a tonal riser. As you can see, I made this one myself inside of Serum. And then I have another sample riser over here. This is a little bit more of a noisy feeling, but it also has some cool modulations in there. So you can hear that for this particular part of the track, because we're in the break, I'm using a completely different set of risers and downlifters. And again, that is just to make this segment more interesting. One of the other things that I often like to do towards the end of my production is maybe layer in some more risers and downlifters on top of my main ones. So these ones over here will get a few layers as well, this stuff and all of this stuff. And that is again to just keep it a little bit more interesting. Now the way that I'm going to mix those is again following the same philosophy of having a main element and having support elements, but this time within the effects themselves, in the sense that these elements that you see over here and over here are still going to be the main riser and downlifter that you're going to hear. But there's going to be extra textures and extra layers that kind of sit beneath it and just add a little bit of variety to that segment over another segment or something like that. So that's everything that I want to talk about for today. I hope that you found this interesting. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and making sure that you're subscribed. Another way to support my channel is by watching some more of my content. So there will be 2 videos up on the screen right now for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.